Welcome, fellow synthesizer sickos. Today we're going to be checking out Polyend Synth, a brand new 8-voice digital synthesizer that is inherently tritimbral. It features 8 different synth engines and 60 Polyphonic Aftertouch capable backlit pads at an incredible launch price of $500. Let's begin. So at the core of Polyend Synth are scenes. You can think of scenes as presets. Scenes are more than that, though. You can see that the grid setup changed as I changed the scene. It also controls different macros that are set up on a per scene basis, as well as different settings for the Polyphonic Aftertouch. The synthesizer engine types as well as different effect settings are stored in scenes as well. So let's just check out a couple of these. We can, of course, change the grid layout by going into the menu to grid and then grabbing the first macro knob. And you can see that we can change this to all sorts of different layouts depending on what we want to do as far as our play style is concerned. The last 3 layouts are also very useful because it gives us control chromatically over each of the 3 synth engines. And no matter what mode you're in, the extra lit up squares represent octaves. I like the 3x3 grid just because it keeps it simple for my Neanderthal brain to understand what's happening with each synth layer. I'm going to pull up an initialized scene and go back into the menu so we can check out the different ways we can configure the grid. Let's take the layout from Florida Man to 3x3 again. Blue always represents the first synth engine, gold always represents the second, and violet represents the third. And again, lit up squares are octaves. I know it seems like we're getting into the weeds already, but this is where the real magic happens. There are 5 different modes each grid can be in. The default mode is note, which steps through the degrees of the scale you've selected. We can change the root note by moving the 3rd macro knob. And we can change the scale type. There's so many different types in here. And you can see that affects the grid as well. Let's just leave it on C minor for now. Now, as we go about making this scene, I'm going to be thinking about the blue synthesizer as the baseline, the gold synthesizer as the pad or polysynth sound, and the violet synthesizer as the lead. So with this in mind, why don't we go back into the synth section and assign the voices we're going to use. We have 8 voices to use split up among the 3 synthesizer engines. So in this case, I think the bassline and the lead synthesizer can both be monophonic, giving us 6 whole voices to play with for our polyphonic pad sound. Back into the grid, let's put our polysynth into chord scale mode. Chord scale mode builds whatever kind of chords you want. There's all sorts of different variations built off of the scale you've selected. It defaults to fourths. But I think the most obvious would be to set the chord type to the same as the scale you're in. This will build triads off of the degrees of the scale. If you wanted to get jazzier, we could go for a minor ninth, let's say. really great for ambient music. But for our purposes, let's just go back to a minor chord. We can also change the root note of the grid. So this is useful if you want to have, say, a higher pitched pad than the bass line. Makes a lot of sense, right? We could also put the polysynth into chord mode. This is like chord scale mode, but it doesn't change the type of chord based off of what degree you're working off of. This is useful for parallel harmony type stuff, techno stabs and the like. And then we have chord pack mode. You could program all sorts of cool chord shapes in chord pack mode here that go beyond just straight triads or 7th chords, 9th chords, power chords, whatever you have selected, which is used to great effect in some of the preset scenes. But for our purposes, chord scale's fine. The real magic happens with follower mode. So now that we've put one of the synthesizers into a chord mode, we now have the option to use a follower for the first synthesizer. Now this synth engine will follow the root note of this synth engine. So real quick, why don't we set up a sequence on the bass line? If this channel's known for anything, it's being racist against sequencers, but the sequencer in Polyend Synth is actually really phenomenal. Just hit the sequence button. We could scroll to sequence here. Just put the sequencer into record mode, tap out some notes, put it back into play mode, and now whatever pad you play, you get that sequence back. Back into the grid settings. Let's change the chord back to just a minor chord. And as we change chords on the polysynth, the bass sequence will automatically move with it. You might be thinking to yourself, well, that's pretty cool with 2 synthesizers, but how the hell are you going to play 3 synths at once? Well, we can latch any note simply by holding Shift and playing the note. So if we latch the bass sequence, we can then play the chords with our left hand and lead with the right. You can also release a sustain note by double tapping Shift. It'll get rid of all sustained notes because you might sustain more than one. Okay, let's check out the 8 different synth engines. For now, I'm going to put the gold synth engine into note mode so we can play 6 voices, and the layout into yellow here. So we're just hearing the one synth engine. Let's go back and select the gold synth engine. We can go Shift Scene, or I like just pressing the Synth Engine and Scene, and that pulls up the presets. Now you'll notice that Polyend Synth comes with an incredible amount of presets, and this is just for the first synth engine. You'll see that we have 8 different synth engines here, and each one has its own set of presets. Truly more than you're ever likely to actually get to. Let's take a second to check out each of the 8 different synth engines and my favorite presets from each one. The first engine is Acid, and it's based off of those classic analog mono synths from the 80s. So it's great for bass lines and leads. It's also very simple to tweak, unlike some of the more complicated ones. Here are some of the sounds it can do. Next up, we have Fat. This mode is designed to emulate those lush vintage analog poly synths that I love so much. It features both drift and detune control. It also uses a ladder filter, which contributes to that nostalgic tone. Here's some presets I like. Let's jump ahead a bit to grain. Grain takes standard audio files and then cuts them up into little grains that you could get those iconic cloud-like textures from. Just a gorgeous texture. If we open up the engine here, all these great parameters, different modes. We've got cloud or burst, what we've been listening to before. So yeah, very powerful synth engine. Let's check out a few more presets. Really great vinyl-y texture there. Move on to waves. So unlike the audio file, it's actually a wavetable synthesizer. It allows you to morph between two separate wavetable positions here. So these wavetables allow you to get some pretty gnarly sounds you couldn't do with traditional virtual analog. Whenever I think of wavetables, I think of bells. Kind of has like a retro video game type sound. Let's move on to what I'm assuming is called Wavetable FM. Wavetable FM is a 2-operator FM synth that instead of limiting you to sine waves, gives you wavetables. Using wavetables gives you a whole lot more power than your typical DX7 style FM synthesizer. Crystalline is a really good example of that DX70 type thing. That'd be pretty good with an ARP cute keys. Really awesome dubsteppy territory too. We can get into some fake Rhodes territory. VAP, or Virtual Analog Polysynth, is a 2-oscillator synthesizer a la the JP8000 or Lead 2. Also comes with a bunch of different filter types. Here's some presets. Pretty awesome bass lines. Hard techno kicks. great trance plucks. And even the famous What the Patch from the Alpha Juno 2. The good Reese. Okay, next we have the physical modeling synthesis. This more mysterious type of synthesis is really great for getting a more realistic sound out of a digital synthesizer. Wow, you can hear how glassy and beautiful that is. You can do these great sort of mallets bouncing on strings type sounds. Reminds me of that old Mac plugin Sculpture. Do any of you guys remember that one? Really great sort of blown type sounds too. And finally, we have the classic phase distortion synthesis a la a CZ101. Very proudly digital. Awesome. Okay, so we've heard all the synth engines. Why don't we go ahead and make ourselves a little synth jam? Let's go ahead and create a phase distortion init patch for our gold synth. Let's go ahead and move to the OG square here. And if we change the Y mod here, get all sorts of different harmonics. Jumping into page 2, we could adjust the tunings. We could tune it to like a fifth. Character. Detune. And then we could try the other models, so like OG Saw. Hermite. Really like that one because it has this sort of hollow phase distortion sound. Now you can hear as we go up into high notes here, we do get some aliasing. Something to be aware of. Okay, so let's jump into the sequencer, but this time, why don't we change it to an arpeggiator? We'll turn the octave range down so we don't hit those high notes. We have all sorts of different types here. Dyad's interesting because it plays 2 notes at a time. Or triad, same idea. Inside out. Groove is especially useful because you could see these little indicators up here showing you the different patterns we can get. So we don't get locked into the super boring. We can change that up. I like that one because what I want to do with this bell sound is add a little delay. So I want to have some little spaces in the sound that the delay can fill in. So I'm going to go back to the engine and see if I can make this a little more bell-like. Actually, let's go to the filter. And what we could do is increase the envelope amount so we get a little more brightness in there. We can increase the resonance. And we can change the different types. We've got state variable filters. Oberheim filters, I'm assuming. High pass filters even. For a different kind of sound. Bandpass filters. And a beautiful notch. We love notch in this house. We could just go back to, say, that state variable 24. That's giving a lot more bells. So like I said, I wanted to get some delay in this. The button on the top left is the mixer, but if we hold shift, that'll take us to the effects section. But we got to go back to the mixer first and actually turn up the delay send on the gold synthesizer. So for now, we'll bring it all the way to 0, just for this example. Then let's go into the effects. The first effect is chorus. We'll skip that and go to delay. Never mind, that was a little much. Let's bring it maybe down by 12. Now we can change the model from triple tap to something else. So we start with single. You can hear there's a pretty good amount of flutter in there. So why don't we just get rid of that? A lot of feedback too, which is cool. We could change to a dual tap. This is nice in stereo. We can control that here, of course. We even have ping pong, my fave. We can change the time, right? So we could get this a little tighter. If we wanted to add a little bit of flutter in there, a little modulation. Gets pretty seasick pretty quick, so something like 5% seems like a good idea. Very cool. So I want to call your attention to something. If we go back into synths and we change the voices down to 1, we could turn them all the way down to 0, for instance, if you wanted to just use one synth with 8 voices, let's say. But for this case, we can actually get away with just one voice. So we're only using 3 voices because with an arpeggiator, you're only using one voice at a time anyways. While we're in the effects, why don't we just go ahead and check the other ones out. So I'm going to turn the delay down, and we'll turn the modulation up. So this is our chorusing. And then check this out. So we have a few different modes. We got single for a very mono sound. Of course, we're going to want stereo, right? Then we've also got stereo with cross mod. Sorry, cross feedback, I should say, not cross mod. We can take that mod depth to where it's very warbly, variation, add some randomness. Time shift affects that sort of smearing sound. If we crank the feedback, it's going to turn into more of a flanger. If that's what you're looking for. Let's go back to the mixer and turn that down. And now let's check out the reverb, everybody's favorite effect. All right, so we have a few different types. We've got natural. Sounds pretty good. Little ringy. Plate to my ears sounds smoother. And then warp here is going to give us those really huge ambient tails, and it's that lusher, more modulated sort of lexicon thing. Gets a little ringy metallic at low values, but we could go real big, right? And you could hear that modulation in there. We could dampen it a bit. Not too much brightness or it starts to get a little unnatural. But who knows, maybe that's what you're going for. So jumping back to the mixer, why don't we now set a tasteful amount of all of those with a heavy emphasis on the delay, I think. So that sounds really great. Let's jump back into the menu here and go to the grid. Let's change the layout back to 3x3 so we can see all 3 of our instruments. Now, I want to put the gold one into chord scale, because up to this point I've had to use 3 fingers to play a triad, right? But if I put it into chord scale, now it'll kind of just do it for me. Oh, and I got to change the chord from power fourths to minor. That should do the trick. Sounds great. Let's jump into the engine again. And I want to go and actually tune the second oscillator just an octave up, because that 7th is conflicting with the 2nd degree of that minor scale. So here's how this sounds. And if we latch the bass line, great. Let's move on to the lead. Jumping over to Synth Engine 3, you can see we're in acid mode. By the way, this little screen is incredible. Just super clear. You can see it from far away. No eye strain at all. Really incredible at this price point. Let's go ahead and, wow, we could either shift scene or hold down the engine and scene and change the preset. But in this case, if we just go to engines, let's go to fat for that virtual analog sound. And then in it will get us a initialized preset for the fat engine. Let's start with the filter, turn the resonance all the way off and turn the filter all the way up, just so we can hear what we're doing with the oscillators. Back to the engine, we can control the fatness and the fatness LFO, so that's the amount of drift going on here. I want to get that sort of tight sound. The brightness is pretty intense. We go negative, we start bringing in like a sub oscillator. But in this case, just the upsaw is fine. We can bring in some noise too if we wanted. And then timbre takes us from sawtooth to square wave. And all the way through a pulse. But in this case, a dual sawtooth is perfect. Let's go to the filter. And guys, I hope you see just how quick and easy the editing is. It's very smartly laid out. We've got these 9 control knobs plus these macro knobs. We're going to get into those later. But I didn't even have to really explain that. I think it's so intuitive how this all works. Let's bring the cutoff down. Increase the envelope amount. Let's go to the ADSRs for the first time. So we can increase the attack of the envelope. And the big thing is going to be the release, right? Let's increase the filter attack. And release, decay, all of that stuff. Back to the engine. Let's add a little bit more drift in. Now we're getting a little voice stealing from the release. So it's as simple as jumping into the synths here and increasing the voices. So since we're using a monophonic bass line and an arpeggiator, which also only needs 1 voice, I'm actually going to use the 6 voices on the lead instead for this sort of brass sound. No more voice stealing. Sounds very beautiful. Jumping in the filters, let's just check the types real quick. We've got this MG24 and then OB24 and OB12. I'm going to go with the 12. Pretty good CS80 brass. Jump in the mixer and jump to page 2 and just same idea. Let's add some chorus, delay, and reverb. More reverb than delay on this one. But what would a good CS80 patch be without Polyphonic Aftertouch? Let's bring the envelope amount down a bit, actually. That way we have a little bit more of a muted brass sound, so we can make up some of that high end with Aftertouch instead. Let's go into the macro settings. We haven't talked about macros yet. First, let's go into Aftertouch/pressure. And what we can do is we've got 5 slots for Aftertouch. So let's select a parameter. So this brings us to our oscillator page, right? But we want to adjust the filter. So just go to filter. And then the moment I adjust the filter cutoff, you could see now Aftertouch pressure is controlling that. And I think a lot of people are going to want to know, how do these pads actually feel? They are silky to the touch, and playing them feels as great as that first sip of coffee after you've gone on a hard bender. Jumping back, let's talk about macros a bit. We also can control things with velocity. I feel like that's pretty self-explanatory, but if you want to adjust things, that's how you do it here. Generally, C1, C2, and C3 are set up to be timbre, motion, and experiment. When you're making your own patches, you can set it up however you want, but the standard is to control it with the timbre at the top, adding more motion with the second knob, and experimentational type sounds, it's not a word, with the third knob. And this screen is context dependent on what synth engine you started with. So because we're on the brass synth, when we're in here, if we look at the macros, timbre is actually automatically set up to affect the filter cutoff. If we go back and select the phase distortion synth, going into timbre, you can see it's actually defaulting to oscillator shape. So it does different things depending on what synth engine you're using. But of course we could change all of that. Jumping back to our CS80 sound, let's say we wanted to control the speed of the sound. All right, so right now it's affecting oscillator noise, filter cutoff, resonance, and fatness all at once. So we can hear what that sounds like. That's actually really cool, but I've got a different idea in mind. So let's go into macros, go to experiment, and we're going to just delete everything that they set up ahead of time. We'll go to the empty slot, select parameter, and now the first knob we touch, I'm actually going to go to the ADSR here. I'm going to touch the attack, and the moment I do, you can see that it is created that routing in there. So let's go to the next one, select parameter, ADSR, decay, and then let's go to the next one. Select it. We'll go to the second ADSR, so this is the filter ADSR, and select attack. And then for the third one, we're going to go into the ADSR second page for the filter and go to the decay. Now, let's set all of these to, let's go with like 80. I don't know, we're just trying stuff. Now, because this one macro knob is controlling 4 parameters, the attack and decay, as I turn it, it's going to slow the sound down. Actually probably even make that more extreme. So let's just go into experiment and increase that a bit. There we go, go back out, and now we can. We can really slow that sound down for a nice pad. We go back into the macros to experiment here, and we turn bipolar on. Now, when we turn the knob the other way, we can actually tighten the sound up. Which is pretty neat. Okay, so let's say we want to adjust the filter cutoff on all 3 synthesizers at once. We could do that by going into timbre here. We've got filter cutoff already set up. Let's increase that to 100% and make sure bipolar is on. Jump over to the gold synth, same idea, macros, timbre, and then we can delete these routings, select parameter, filter, change the cutoff, and it automatically assigns it just about 100. Let's go back. select the first synthesizer, go to macros. That's MIDI. Let's go to macros. It's amber, and filter cutoff is set up here. Make sure bipolar's on. Okay, we're going back. So as it is, if I latch this note and I move the timbre knob, it's only going to affect the bass line. However, if I hold all three and move the knob, you can see that it's combo mode now. So I'm going to latch 3 notes just for this example so you can hear what that sounds like. I guess for the gold synth, a better destination for the macro would actually not be filter cutoff. It would be the filter envelope amount. So we're going to put that in, try that again. And of course, each engine could be controlling up to, 5 parameters at once per knob. So you could be controlling a total of 15 parameters across 3 synth engines with 1 knob. And we've got 3 different macros to set up. So it's really powerful. And it goes without saying, you could also do this type of thing with just 2 of the synth engines instead of 3. Let's cover just a couple more things that I haven't gone through rapid fire. We have a pitch bend here, this knob. Instead of your traditional pitch wheel. We also have a global tempo control, so we can speed stuff up or slow it down. With a max speed of 400 for you absolute crackheads. Let's talk modulation real quick. So depending on what synth engine you're in, you get different modulation pages. Now, for the Fat engine, we only really have these 2 controls, but on some of the other ones, it gets a lot more complicated. With synth engines with 9 or less modulation destinations, you just see the parameter or the destination there, and then the amount is controlled directly from the knob. Jumping over to the phase distortion synth, you can see that we actually have 2 full pages, so a total of 6 modifiers that can be routed to 6 different destinations. So source 1, and we can change what that is from here, going to different destinations. There's a lot of stuff here. Hopefully I didn't mess that up too bad. And then the amount is controlled here. So in this case, it didn't make any difference because the amount, and it is a bipolar control too. But on our little brass sound, we could just increase the filter LFO. Which leads nicely into the LFO page. So in here, we can control the speed. Going way into audio rate. We could also change the waveform to, say, a ramp down. That's a great way to create sort of a faux pluck sound or have sort of a more complex pluck shape. And then we can also change it from one shot, basically using it as an envelope, to free running or re-triggering every note, depending on what you want to do. I don't really want that as part of this sound, so I'm going to turn the filter LFO off here. But that's how modulations work in Polyend Synth. Okay, let's talk some pros and cons about Polyend Synth. In lieu of a typical list, I'm going to give you examples of who I think the synthesizer is for, as well as people who I don't think Polyend Synth is a good match. Polyend sent me the synths to check out, but the following opinions are my own. So the first example of someone Polyend Synth is a match for is someone who wants to play live without lugging a big ol' synthesizer with them. The form factor is phenomenal, and easily the greatest part of the design is being able to control 3 synthesizers at once with 2 hands. They really knocked it out of the park, and the way that you could change the layout to make it work for you is incredible. I could absolutely see someone showing up to a synth jam or a gig with just Polyend Synth and some drum machine, and you're good to go. Always having 3 synthesizer engines active, so you've got your bass, pads, and leads always covered from one instrument, It's really something special that they've done here. And the sound engine is more than enough to deliver some really complex, interesting sounds. It's much more than bread and butter stuff, especially when you get into the physical modeling and granular stuff. Obviously, I only scratched the surface with those engines. This video is already long enough. I could probably do an equally long video just talking about those two synth engine types. So unlike a lot of other gizmos at this price point and form factor that feel a little bit more like toys than serious studio instruments, I do think Polyend Synth is a studio quality instrument that you could play live out with, and that's awesome. The next person I think Polyend Synth is a perfect match for is anybody who wants to get into Polyphonic Aftertouch on a budget. Coming in $100 cheaper than a Hydrosynth Explorer and $300 cheaper than a Hydrosynth Desktop, which I think is the most comparable model because it's got the Polyphonic Aftertouch pads. Polyend Synth is an incredible bargain, and unlike some other Polyphonic Aftertouch synthesizers that have somewhat cheap feeling keys or pads, I think the pads on Polyend Synth feel great. They're very expressive. I never had any double notes or anything like that. It just worked perfectly and did exactly what I wanted it to do all the time. And even the mighty Hydrosynth Deluxe is only bitimbral, so Polyend Synth might be one of the only synthesizers ever to allow you to play 3 synthesizers with Polyphonic Aftertouch all at the same time. And finally, the third type of person I think Polyend Synth is a perfect match for is actually a beginner. Sometimes when you call a synthesizer a beginner synth, it sounds like a pejorative, like I'm saying that Polyend Synth can't do as much as other synthesizers. But that's not the case at all. What I mean by a beginner synth is at $500, I can't think of anything that beats it in terms of value. And if you're using the acid or fat synth engine types, it's very simple to get your head around. There's not that many parameters. The mod destination menu has been greatly simplified. But on the other hand, you can go all the way from that to some seriously deep synthesis with the physical modeling, the granular, and the phase distortion. Really complicated sounds with a lot of modulation routing going on. And it's all very simple to do. I really think the screen is critical here because if it wasn't a perfect integration with those 12 knobs, it wouldn't work. There's been plenty of synthesizers that have had a set of knobs that changes depending on what menu you're looking at, where it's so easy to get lost. But I was never lost using Polyend Synth. It's just very intuitive. What you see is what you get. Everything's laid out very clearly. It's masterfully done. You can tell that they've taken their experience from Polyend Play and Tracker and translated it to this product. Also, with the ability to play 3 instruments at once, a beginner doesn't need to multi-track or anything. They can just play it out. And I can't stress enough how powerful that follower option is in the grid types. Being able to latch a sequencer and play an arpeggiator and have the pattern change based on what note you're playing with one finger, that's huge. That means you can do an entire song by playing one finger at a time with your left hand and play leads with your right. I'm surprised no one's done this before because now that I've seen it, you can't unsee it, sort of a thing. It's very clever. And again, I only scratched the surface. I barely talked about chord maps. That's huge too, that you could do custom chords for each pad. I mean, the sky's really the limit. Now let's talk about who I don't think Polyend Synth is a perfect match for. The first would be someone who loves big, warm, vintage analog tones. That's just not what Polyend Synth excels at. I think it's a proudly digital synth, and even when it's doing virtual analog, it sounds more like the JP8000 than a Jupiter 8. I think the synthesizer really excels in purely digital types of synthesis like phase distortion, granular, and physical modeling. And then you've got the wavetable and virtual analog modes there for your more bread and butter type sounds. They sound good, but they don't sound particularly analog at all. And if you want to get a digital synth that has the flexibility and power of digital, but can also fake analog pretty good, I do think Modal and ASM have better options for that. Polyend Synth to me has a very sort of 90s sheen about it. I mean, I don't know if they're really doing granular synthesis in the 90s, but you know what I mean. Like the tone of the synthesizer sort of harkens back to that era in a good way. But that's not everybody's favorite flavor. And if you love really fat analog tone, this might not be the synth for you. Another type of person that Polyend Synth isn't a perfect match for would be someone who wants an all-in-one device to be able to make music. You might think with 3 synth engines that's enough to create a song, and for ambient music it certainly is. There are some scenes with some pre-built sort of rudimentary drums made into it, but it's not a full groove box the way some of Polyend's other products are. And now that I've experienced the chord scale and follower modes, I kind of just wish there was one more layer that could be the drum layer so you could control all three of those at once with one finger. I just think that makes sense, and you can tell that this synthesizer has that tracker heritage, but it's missing the drums component, which is pretty obvious when you see what the synthesizer is, right? It's a synth, it's not a groove box. But I do think some people might be confused about that because there are other products labeled synthesizer that have drums built in. So Polyend Synth is very much a synthesizer. It's very much three synthesizers in one, but it's not a groove box in any way. I think it's an awesome complement to a groove box because you could have that going, feeding the MIDI clock into Polyend Synth, and then have three synth engines with full polyphonic aftertouch under your fingertips. But on its own, I don't think it's enough to make a full song unless your idea of ambient music is turning on a washing machine. And finally, I don't think Polyend Synth is a good match for you if you can only be happy with a knob per function synthesizer. I hope throughout the course of this video you've seen how easy it is to program Polyend Synth. It's got 9 programming knobs and 3 macro knobs, so you're going to have menus, you're going to have shift functions. There's a lot of that in this synth. But at this price point, there are other synthesizers that feel more immediate. They're not going to be tritimbral, they're not going to have polyphonic aftertouch. But if you're one of those psychopaths who sends a synthesizer back to Sweetwater the first time you have to press the shift button, Polyend Synth is not for you. So in conclusion, I think Polyend Synth is a triumph. 8 voices feels like a great amount of voices to have. Generally speaking, I do use it in a 2 synth engines with 1 voice, so a bass and a lead, plus a polyphonic 6-voice synthesizer. 6 voices would be good for any old poly synth. And it really does have its own unique flavor. I love synthesizers that have a character to them as opposed to just being sort of vanilla. And I think Polyend Synth inherits some of the flavor from Tracker and Play Plus, which is a good thing. A little aroma of 90s grit. The sound's not going to be for everybody. You do get some aliasing. The filter's not as smooth and creamy as an analog filter, or even some of the digital filters from some of Polyend's competitors. But Polyend Synth represents Polyend's journey into pure synthesis. With 8 synth engines, which is double a Polyend Play Plus, which costs $300 more, by the way, you can tell this product is about pure sound design. This is for the tweakers who want to get into some real Modulation Matrix shenanigans. It's simple enough that a beginner could use it, but it's deep enough that a professional studio synthesist could sink their teeth into it and reap a tremendous bounty. This video is shaped up to be pretty long, and I really only began to get into this guy. And I re-emphasize, this video is certainly not exhaustive as far as showing what's possible with the synthesizer. It is an incredible product at a jaw-dropping price. And I'm super excited to see how people use and abuse Polyend Synth in all sorts of ways that I can't even imagine. All right, I'm going to be doing a live stream checking out Polyend Synth, answering your guys' questions as well as making music live. So if you want to know more about the synthesizer, please hit the video on the screen right now. Continue to be excellent, guys, and I will see you there.